Good morning and welcome to the GyaanELL Season 15, the national webinar on myth, literature and hermeneutics. The PG English Association and Neshamani Memorial Christian College, Marthandam, feels immensely happy to welcome you all to this program. Let us begin the program with a formal welcome speech by one of our participants of PG English, Miss Ovia. I request Miss Ovia to welcome the gathering.
Good morning. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Okay, shall I start?
Yes, yes.
A very warm good morning to all. Today we have gathered here to attend the GyaanELL Season 15 National Webinar on the topic Myth, Literature and Hermeneutics, organized by PG English Association and Internal Quality Assurance Cell of NMCC. I'm glad to address the welcome note for this event. It's my privilege to welcome our principal, Dr. K. Balraj sir, our correspondent, Advocate L. Rajadurai sir. I welcome the Honorable Resource Person, Dr. A. Joseph Duraj sir, who is currently working as a professor at School of English in Gandhiram University, Dindigul. Welcome you, sir. It's my pleasure to welcome the head of the English department, Dr. T.B. Thomas sir, the professors and the research scholars. I welcome you all. Last but not the least, I welcome all the students, the members of IQAC who have gathered here virtually to participate in the webinar and make this a successful one. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ovia, for the short welcome address. We don't want to waste time. We directly go into the meeting. I also welcome our resource person, Dr. Joseph Duraj. I also welcome our principal, Dr. K. Balraj, our correspondent, Advocate L. Rajadurai, learned members of English department, the dignitaries who are present here in this GyaanELL Season 15. Let me begin by introducing our resource person for the day, Dr. Joseph Duraj. Dr. Joseph Duraj is a professor of English at the School of English and Foreign Languages at Gandhigram Rural Institute, deemed to be university at Gandhigram in Tamil Nadu. He was the Vice Chancellor acting of Gandhigram Rural University from September 2013 to May 2014. He was a Fulbright scholar in 2014 and visited educational institutions in Washington, D.C., New York, and Miami, and was an Erasmus Mundus visiting scholar at KU, Leuven, Belgium in 2015. He conducted a month-long teacher training program in Kandy, Sri Lanka in August 2007. He has also visited Georgian University, Rome, Radboud University, the Netherlands, Center Service at Paris. As we all know, he is specialized in theory. He has authored 4 books, one in 2003 titled Myth and Literature, Interventions, Essays in Philosophy and Literary Theory in 2006, Philosophical Hermeneutics in 2011, and FAQs on Research in Literature and Language in 2019. He has also edited 2 books, Critical Essays on Indian English Poets and Essays on Gandhi. His book, Essays on Higher Education in India, will be published shortly. He has co-authored standard 11 and 12 English textbooks for the Tamil Nadu government. He is also the founder editor of a peer-reviewed journal called Gandhigram Literary Review. He has published 52 articles in various refereed journals and 8 book reviews, and has completed 1 major UGC scheme project and 2 minor research projects. He has guided 16 PhD students and has adjudicated more than 95 PhD theses for different universities in India. He was a visiting professor of philosophy at Satya Nilayam, which is affiliated to the University of Madras, where he taught a course on philosophical hermeneutics. In February 2016, he was at the Department of English, Osmania University, Hyderabad, as a visiting professor and delivered a series of lectures. He regularly lectures at UGC HRDCs and has delivered 12 endowment lectures in different colleges and universities in India. He was a member of the Research Council of IGNOU, New Delhi, from 2007 to 2013, and also Academic Council member from 2013 to 2015. Dr. Duraj is also an assessor for NAC since 2010. And he has assessed and accredited 32 colleges and universities in different parts of India, in which 13 of them, he was the chairperson of the NAC peer team. He was also involved in the preparation of the NAC Revised Accreditation Framework 2017. He has completed 2 major assignments for UPSC New Delhi. So we have such an eminent personality who is an expert in theory, philosophy, who is there who has given wonderful sessions on different topics. We have such a renowned personality today to talk on the topic myth, literature, and hermeneutics. Now it is over to Dr. Joseph Duraj. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Professor TB.
Thank you, sir.
Advocate L. Rajadurai, Secretary, Nesamani Memorial Christian College. Dr. K. Paul Raj, the Principal of Nesamani Memorial Christian College. Professor T.B. Thomas, the Head of the Department of English and also the IQAC Coordinator. My friend, Professor Joseph Dunstan. In fact, he is the catalyst and he is responsible for this lecture. And another of my friends, Reverend Dr. K.L. George, the former principal of St. Joseph's College, Darjeeling. Faculty members, Nesamani Memorial Christian College, friends from other colleges and universities across the country, and dear student friends. Good morning to all of you. At the outset, I would like to thank Professor T.B. Thomas and the Department of English at Nesamani Memorial Christian College for this warm invitation to deliver a lecture on myth, literature, and hermeneutics. In fact, this invitation from Nesamani Memorial Christian College came to me through my friend Professor Dunstan, and he asked me if I can talk on archetypal criticism. I said, yes, I will certainly talk on archetypal criticism, but why not have a broader canvas? And that is how we arrived at this topic, myth, literature, and hermeneutics. So dear friends, for the next 60 to 70 minutes, I shall be talking on myth, literature and hermeneutics. And I am sure there will be some questions after my presentation and I will be happy to answer them. Now I'll be sharing my screen with you. Professor TD, is my screen visible?
Yes, sir.
Is it in the full screen mode?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. So dear friends, this is the scheme of my presentation. My presentation today is divided into 4 parts or 4 units. In the first part, I have just one slide for the first unit. I'll be talking on what is myth, and I will also be talking about the various features or characteristics of myth. Once I define myth and talk about its characteristics, I would like to talk about the various myth scholars from the domains of anthropology, literature, psychology, and other domains. And I'll be talking about the significant contributions of 9 myth scholars. So that would constitute the second part of my lecture. Then in the third part of my lecture, very briefly, I'll map the connection or the association between myth on the one hand and literature on the other. And towards the end of my presentation, I shall be talking about myth hermeneutics, wherein I'll be very specifically talking about demythologization. So this is the scheme of my lecture. It is divided into 4 parts. Now in the first part, I'll be addressing 2 questions. The first question, what is myth? How do we define myth? And what are the characteristics of myth? Now, as students of literature and as Indians, we are all familiar with a variety of myths. As students of literature, we are familiar with the Oedipus myth. We are also familiar with the Daedalus myth. We are familiar with the myth of Orestes. So, as students of literature, we have been exposed to a lot of myths, particularly from the Greek mythological stratum and also the Roman mythology. As Indians, we are very familiar with our own Indian mythology. So whether it is a literary myth or myth from a religious point of view, all of us are aware of the fact that basically myth is a story. So if you were to ask me what is myth, how do I define myth? The answer is very simple. Myth is a story. It is a narrative. It is a tale. So once we define myth as a story, then we have a string of questions attached to it. If it is a story like Macbeth, or a story like Julius Caesar, or a story like Emma, or a story like a portrait of the artist as a young man, then we need to ask a series of questions. Who is the author? When was the story composed? Who are the main characters? Why was this story composed in the first place? And a few other questions. Now, similarly, once we define myth as a story, as a narrative, as a tale, we need to address all these questions. So, therefore, myth is a story. Now, who are the main characters? Who are the principal characters? Who are the protagonists? And the answer is myth is a narrative, a sacred narrative. And in most of the myths, whether they are Indian myths or Judeo Christian myths or European myths or Egyptian myths, we come to realize that most of the myths they talk about gods and goddesses. But at the same time, we have to remember not all myths talk about gods and goddesses. We have a great myth scholar called G.S. Kirk. So, Professor G.S. Kirk, an authority on Greek myth, he has written a book on Greek myths. He says, yes, it is true, myths are about gods and goddesses, about sacred characters, but at the same time, we realize there are myths like Oedipus, myths like Orestes, myths like Gilgamesh, which are not about gods and goddesses. Then the third point that we have to address is this. When did this story happen? When did this story action take place? For this, I would like to use a Latin phrase, in illo tempore. Now, how do I translate it into English? It means primordial time, ancient time. So the story of Oedipus, or the story of Gilgamesh, or the story of Zeus, or the story of Daedalus, or the story of Icarus, or the story of Orestes, and we include the Indian myths, the Judeo-Christian myths. When does the action take place? The action takes place in primordial time, in illo tempore. Now, earlier I gave the example of Shakespeare's Macbeth, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Jane Austen's Emma, and Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man. Now, when we talk about literary narratives, we ask this question: who composed it? Who wrote it? Who is the author? So once we define myth as a story, once we define myth as a narrative, then we need to ask this question: who is the writer? Who is the composer? Now, we do not have any concrete answer. For instance, the story of Oedipus or the story of Orestes, who composed it? Of course, we can always say it was Aeschylus. No, Aeschylus came much later. Now, what we have to realize is myths belong to the oral tradition, whether they are Indian myths or Judeo-Christian myths. Myths belong to the oral tradition, and they do not have a single author as such. So therefore, when we talk of the authorship of myths, whatever be the myths, whether they are sacred myths or literary myths, we come to realize that as far as the authorship is concerned, it is both anonymous and at the same time it is collective. Then the fifth characteristics of myth is, now what is the purpose of myths? The answer is, if you ask anthropologists and phenomenologists of religion, they make it very clear. The purpose of myths is etiological. Now, what is the meaning of the term etiological? The meaning of the term etiological is it talks about origins. For instance, we have questions like, when did death enter the world? When did evil enter the world? When did mortality enter the world? Okay, if you want answers for these questions, then we have to go back to myths. Myths will tell you when death entered the world. In that sense, myths are etiological. Then the next question that we have to address is, what exactly is the relationship or what exactly is the association between myths on the one hand and rites and rituals on the other? Now, a lot of people have talked about it, a lot of people have written about it, but in particular, I would like to refer to the contributions of two anthropologists, Victor Turner and Clyde Lacombe. Both of them are eminent anthropologists, and among other issues, they have talked about the connection or the association between myths on the one hand and rites and rituals on the other. Now, whether you are a Christian or a Hindu or a Buddhist, or even as teachers or students, we all indulge in rituals. As teachers, as students, we have academic rituals. But as believers in a particular faith, we have religious rituals. Lighting a candle is a ritual. Breaking a coconut is a ritual. Now, why do we do this? Why do we undertake these rituals? So ritual is a repetitive behavior. This is how anthropologists and sociologists define ritual. Now, why do you do this? Okay, the theoretical explanation is given by myths. So therefore, ritual concerns action and the justification, the theoretical justification is provided by myths. And that exactly is the connection between myths on the one hand and rites and rituals on the other. Now, the last question, what exactly was, I'm using the past tense and I will also use the present tense, what exactly was and is the role played by myths in cultures and societies? Now, the answer is Aristotle has already talked about it. He has spelled out the connection between the ethic and the mythic. Now, the answer is myths play a normative dimension. Now today, let us go to colleges and universities. If you were to join a college, if you were to join a hostel in a college or a university, then you are given a set of rules and regulations. You have to come at this time, you have to switch off your light at this time, breakfast is served from this time to this time, dinner is served from this time to this time. You should not use your cell phone during study hours. So, which means modern men and women, in order to lead decent lives, we are given a set of regulations, we are given a set of guidelines. But what about primitive societies? What about primitive men and women? They did not have any book of constitutions. They did not have any rule book. They did not have any set of guidelines. But at the same time, they also needed guidelines or ethical dimensions in different form. And this normative dimension was provided to them by myths. So therefore, this marks the end of the first unit of my presentation. So in this particular slide, or in this unit, the first unit, I have addressed to two questions. What is myth and what are the characteristics of myth? To summarize, we all realize that myth is a story. It is a symbolic story where the key characters are gods and goddesses. And because of the presence of gods and goddesses, there is the dimension of numinosity. In Latin, it is called tremendum et fascinans. And regarding the authorship of myths, we realize that because they belong to the oral tradition, they are both anonymous and collected. Then I have also spelled out the relation between myths on the one hand and rites and rituals on the other. And finally, I highlighted the ethical or the normative dimension of myths. So that was the first part. Now, in the second part of my presentation, I would like to talk about 9 eminent myth scholars. And these myth scholars, they come from various domains. Some of them are philosophers, some of them are anthropologists, some of them, at least one of them is a semiologist, one of them is a phenomenologist of religion, one of them is a psychologist, so from various domains. Okay, I'll be talking about the significant contributions of 9 myth scholars. I'll be talking about their major works and their major insights. Now, the first one I would like to talk about is a German philosopher called Ernest Cassiere, who lived from 1874 to 1945. He has a number of publications, but as far as myth is concerned, his most important contribution is volume 2 of his 3-volume book, The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms. And this particular volume, that is the second volume, is titled The Mythical Thought, and it was published in 1955. So this is Ernest Cassiere, a German philosopher. Now the question is, what was his important or what was his significant contribution to the domain of mythology? Now Ernest Cassiere, in his discourses on myth, he talks about 3 elements, he talks about 3 components, he talks about myth, he talks about language, and he talks about science. Then he argues, you look at the development of any culture. You look at the way a culture develops. He says there are 3 stages or 3 phases. The primitive phase is the phase of myth, and the advanced phase is the phase of science. And in between, you have the phase of language. So in other words, you start with myth, then the culture moves on to the sphere of language and ultimately ends up with an advanced state, so that is science. So to summarize the major contribution of Ernest Cassiere, the German philosopher, he would argue mythical thought is primitive. But even though it is primitive, it constitutes an important stage, a necessary and an integral stage in the development of human culture. So this is about Ernest Cassiere. Now the next person is an interesting person. He is a Polish-born British anthropologist. Look at his name, Malinowski. Look at the ending. So you can easily guess it must be Russian or Polish. So this man was a Pole. He was Polish, so he was born in Poland, later emigrated to UK. So he is known as a Polish-born British anthropologist. He lived from 1884 to 1942. Now, during Malinowski's time, there was a debate or there was a power struggle between 2 schools of anthropology. So one school was headed by, as students of literature, we are all very familiar with the name, Sir James Fraser and his Golden Bough. James Fraser, as students of literature, we are all very familiar with name, and he was at Cambridge University. So 2 major schools of anthropology. So one was headed by Professor James Fraser at Cambridge, and the other school was headed by Malinowski. And what was the power struggle between these 2? Now, Malinowski and others, they accused Fraser and his colleagues of indulging in armchair theorizing or armchair anthropologizing. In other words, as students of anthropology, what should you do? You should not be sitting in the library. You should be going out into the fields as ethnographers and collect data firsthand. So therefore, Malinowski and others had accused Fraser of being an armchair anthropologist. Anyway, let us not go into that debate. But what is important is, if you are an anthropologist and if you are a sociologist as well, from where do you collect your data? From where do you gather your data? You gather your data from the field. So therefore, as an anthropologist, particularly as an ethnographer, you need to you need to take up extensive field work, and that field work would constitute the bulk of your research. So this man, Malinowski, Polish-born British anthropologist, he spent 7 long years with Trobriand Islanders. He lived with them. He lived with a particular tribe, Trobriand Islanders, for 7 long years. At the end of his field data collection, he brought out a book. Please go to the last line. He brought out a book bearing the title Myth in Primitive Psychology, and the book was published in 1948. Fine. Now, 2 questions. What type of anthropology, what type of myth, what was Malinowski's conception of myth? So I need to ask 2 questions. So the first question is, what was Malinowski's conception of myth? How did he look at myths? And second, as far as myth is concerned, what was his what was his significant contribution? Fine. Now, please look at the first 2 lines. I have used 2 terms. If you look at Fraser, James Fraser and his companions, they advanced a theory of myth which would answer questions concerning origins. In my first slide, I talked about the etiological dimension of myth, where you answer questions like when and how did death enter the world. So for which you have a story that will tell you when exactly and how exactly did death enter the world. So that is called etiological. Now, Malinowski and his companions, they were not interested in the etiological theory of myth. Instead, they advanced what is known as a functionalist or a utilitarian theory of myth. Look at the first word, functional. In other words, what function, what role did myths play in the lives of the Trobriand Islanders, or what role did myths play in the life of the primitive society? Okay, so this he addressed and discussed in his book 1948 publication, Myth in Primitive Psychology. And there are 2 quotes. Look at the first one. He says, if you look at the life of Trobriand Islanders, and by extension, if you look at all primitive societies, you come to realize that there is a very close connection between their world, their mythos, and their sacred tales, that is the myths, and the way they behave, they conduct themselves, their rites, their ceremonies, their rituals. So therefore, he says there is a very close connection between myths and the rites and rituals. This was with reference to all primitive societies, particularly the Trobriand Islanders, because Malinowski had spent 7 long years with these people. Now, ultimately, his conclusion is, look at the last 3 lines. He says, what is the role played by myth in primitive societies? He says it was something like a pragmatic charter. Okay, look at these 2 words. I would like to highlight these 2 words, pragmatic charter. Earlier, I gave the example when a student joins a hostel, he or she is given a set of rules and regulations. Now, for the primitive people, they did not have any printed rules and regulations. But all the same, in order to lead decent lives, in order to lead tension-free lives, they also needed a set of rules and regulations. And these rules and regulations were given to them, not directly, but indirectly, tangentially, by myths. And that is why Malinowski says myth was a pragmatic charter, something like a rule book, something like the book of constitutions for the primitive society. So therefore, Malinowski, an important name, a Polish-born British anthropologist. He was a functionalist. He talked about the connection between myths on the one hand and rites and rituals. And ultimately, in his book, Myth and Primitive Psychology, he said myth is a pragmatic charter, a set of rules and regulations for the primitive societies. Ladies and gentlemen, next we go to a very important person, a giant, particularly in the field of phenomenology of religion, Mircea Eliade, who lived from 1907 to 1986. He was a Romanian, but later he emigrated to the United States of America, became an American citizen. He was at the University of Chicago for a very long time, and he was a giant in the field of phenomenology of religion. Now, there are three major works. Okay, the first one came out in 1960, bearing the title Myths, Dreams, and Mysteries. In 1963, Myth and Reality came. So, these two are books. And the third one, because I said he has three major publications, the third one is the multi volume encyclopedia of religion, of which he was the general editor. That is a significant contribution. Now, dear friends, the first thing that we have to ask when we talk about Eliade's contribution to the field of mythology is this: how did he define myths? But more importantly, how did he classify or how did he categorize myths, the taxonomy of myths? Now, very interesting. Eliade, talking about the categorization or the classification of myths, he talked about three categories of myth. Please look at the second, third, and the fourth line. Myths of cosmogony, myths of anthropogony, and myths of theogony. In other words, myths that talk about the genesis of the world, the creation of the world, cosmogony. Myths that talk about the genesis or the creation of anthropos, human beings, men and women, anthropogony. And myths they talk about the creation of gods and goddesses, that would be myths of theogony. Now, cosmogony, the best example is, let us go to the Bible. We have the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the first book in the Bible is the book of Genesis, where the first few chapters they talk about how God created the world, how God created the cosmos. So the genesis of cosmos, cosmogony. So that would be the best example for cosmogony. And if you go to all cultures, all civilization, they have their own stories concerning creation, what is known as creation myths. If you go to Japanese mythology and also one bit of Indian mythology, it says there was a huge big egg, EGG egg, and the world or the cosmos came out of that cosmic egg. So, what is cosmogony? Myths that talk about the creation of the cosmos or the world. Now, once again, you go back to the book of Genesis, the Bible, the book of Genesis. Now, what did God do after creating the world? God created man and later woman. God created Adam and later Eve. So they talk about the story of the creation of human beings, anthropogony. So cosmogony, creation of the world; anthropogony, creation of human beings; and theogony, the Greek word theo means God, goddesses. So creation of gods and goddesses. Now let us take an Indian example for theogony. If you go to West Bengal, the most important festival for the Bengalis is the festival of the goddess of Kali. So what happens? The goddess of Kali destroyed a buffalo demon, and we have the Mahisha Mardana myth. So where the story, the myth talks about how goddess Kali was created in order to destroy the buffalo demon. So this is the creation of a goddess, theogony. So basically, the one of the two major insights of Eliade is the way he has classified or categorized myths into cosmogony, anthropogony, and theogony. Fine. Now let us come to the second point, a more important point and a significant insight. What was the role played by myths in primitive societies and also in modern societies? So what roles do myth play? What is their role? Okay. Now, all religions, whether it is Christianity or Hinduism or other religions, they all tell us that once upon a time when we do not know. Once upon a time, that is primordial time. Earlier, I used the Latin expression in illo tempore. Man was close to gods and goddesses. Man was in paradise. And this is what the book of Genesis tells us. God created the world and God created men and women. They were in the Garden of Eden. They were close to God. But what happened? Man committed a sin. Human beings committed sin. So therefore, there was a rupture. There was a rupture. There was a cleavage, as a result of which they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. They were thrown out of paradise. But what happens is, but still there is the desire, the longing, the yearning to get back to paradise. Okay, so this is a paradigmatic story in all cultures, in all religions. So man was close to gods and goddesses. He was in paradise, or something evil happened, as a result of which he lost that connection. But every day he longs to get back to paradise. Okay. Now the question is how to get back to paradise, or to reframe the question, why do we go to churches? Why do we go to temples? Why do we do this offering? Why do we light a candle? Why do we break a coconut? So the answer is, he says, by indulging in these rites and rituals, human beings have a desire to get back to paradise. In other words, now they are in profane time. Look at the use of the two terms, profane and sacred. Profane, the opposite of profane is holy or sacred. So now we are in profane time. So we want to move away from profane time and we want to enter sacred time. So in other words, he says, he uses two words, myths or cosmogonic, and at the same time paradigmatic. Look at the expression. What is the meaning of paradigmatic? What is a paradigm? It is a model. It is a model. Okay, so what is a model? The acts of gods and goddesses are model to us. They are examples to us. They are like a paradigm to us. So if we imitate the exemplary acts of gods and goddesses, there is the sure possibility that from profane time we can pass into sacred time. So therefore, dear friends, Mircea Eliade is a big name in the domain of mythology and religion. His two major contributions, he classified myths into three categories: cosmogony, anthropogony, and theogony. He also talked about the role, the significant role played by myths in society, and he said they are paradigmatic in nature. The next important person that we would like to study is Claude Lévi-Strauss. As students of literature, we are all familiar with Claude Lévi-Strauss, particularly his structural study of the Oedipus myth. Now, Claude Lévi-Strauss, a French structural anthropologist, lived from 1908 to 2009, while Malinowski spent 7 years with the Trobriand Islanders. Claude Lévi-Strauss spent 17 long years with the American Indian tribe in South America. So he had extensive field work, as a result of which he brought out a lot of books. And for our purposes, the most important book is The Structural Study of Myth in 2 volumes, wherein he undertakes an analysis of the myth of Oedipus using the Caesarean or the structural framework. Fine. Now, two things. Firstly, Lévi-Strauss clarifies that he is not concerned with the etiological or the functional dimensions of myth. I repeat, unlike other anthropologists, and sociologists, Claude Lévi-Strauss makes his stance very clear. Unlike Malinowski, I am not interested in the functional dimension of myth. Unlike other anthropologists like Mircea Eliade and Fraser, I am not interested in the etiological dimension of myth. Instead, he makes his stance very clear. I am interested in the structural study of myth, and that is why he would define myth as a strongly structured story. Fine. Now, as students of literature, we are all familiar with the structural study of myth available in 2 volumes. But most of us may or may not be aware of another significant contribution. Please look at the last line, the story of Asti Wall, with a very good introduction or preface by Edmund Leach. It runs to, if I remember right, 53 pages. Please read this, the story of Astivall. We are not very familiar with this, but instead we are very familiar with the way Claude Lévi-Strauss has handled and analyzed the story of Oedipus. Fine. Now, as modern human beings, people living in 2020, 2021, and very soon 2022, what is our opinion about the primitive societies? If you talk to any young boy or a young girl, oh, the primitive societies, they were not very cultured, they were not very sophisticated, they were very primitive. This is what modern men and women would tell about primitive societies. They were not cultured. Their thought was not very advanced. Their rationality was stunted. But please remember, at the end of the story of Astivall, towards the end, towards the close of the story of Astivall, Claude Lévi-Strauss writes, mythical thought too is structured. So, in other words, he tells us, do not dismiss primitive societies as less cultured or less sophisticated. No, their thought too was structured. So, therefore, we should take them seriously. So this is Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French structural anthropologist. Next, we go to a French philosopher called Paul Ricoeur, who lived from 1913 to 2005. Now, three things about Paul Ricoeur as far as mythology is concerned. Now, the first point is Paul Ricoeur does not talk of literary myths or secular myths. He would restrict himself, he would confine himself to religious myths. That is the first point. And talking about the function of myths in society, in cultures, he would talk of three dimensions or three functions of myths. He would talk of the universality of myths, the temporal orientation of myths, and the ontological exploration of myths. All these you would find particularly in his book, an early book, because he died only in 2005, in his early book called The Symbolism of Evil, which is one of his most important books, and it was published in 1967. So very briefly, what does he mean by universality? What does he mean by temporal orientation? And what does he mean by ontological exploration? Now, universality, he would say, myths embrace humankind as a whole. So, in other words, all men and women are included by myths, and that is why he talks of the universal dimension of myths. Nobody is excluded, everyone is included when we talk about myths. Number two, myths have a past and a future. The past is denoted by the word archaeology, and the future is signified by the term eschatology. So there is a beginning and there is a future. So archaeology and eschatology, that is what he talks, that is what he means by the term temporal orientation. And finally, he talks about what is the role played by myths. They explore the passage or the transition or the shift from innocence to guilt. Earlier, I told you the story of what happened in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were close to God. They enjoyed everything, but they committed sin, as a result of which they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. So, from innocence to guilt. So, ontological exploration, under ontological exploration, the rubrics of ontological exploration, he talks about the rupture or the cleavage, the shift or the passage from innocence to guilt. And finally, and this is the most important, or this is the major contribution of Paul Ricoeur as far as mythology is concerned, he talks about myth hermeneutics. In fact, that is the title of my presentation. The title of my presentation is Myth, Literature, and Hermeneutics. So I will not explain what is myth hermeneutics now, because the last unit of my presentation is devoted exclusively to a discussion of myth hermeneutics. So this is Paul Ricoeur. So please remember three things about Paul Ricoeur. He confines himself to religious myths. He talks about the triple functions of myths, and he talks about the need, the essential need for a myth hermeneutics, about which I will talk a little later. Now, the next two people whom I would like to talk about, Carl Jung and Notre Frei, they come under the label archetypal critics. So Carl Jung was an archetypal critic. Of course, he has other labels as well, but as far as we are concerned, at least for this presentation, we look at Carl Jung as an archetypal critic. And in the next slide, I'll be talking about the Canadian critic Notre, who was also an archetypal critic. So therefore, when I talk about Carl Jung, and in the same vein, when I talk about Notre, the focus will be on the archetypal criticism. Now, what is the major contribution of Carl Jung? Okay, I would like to talk about two major contributions of Carl Jung. One is from a psychological point of view, the other is from an archetypal point of view. Now, from a psychological point of view, all of us know it was Carl Jung, a former disciple of Freud, Sigmund Freud, the founder of modern psychology. He came out with the idea of the collective unconscious. While Sigmund Freud talked about the personal unconscious, it was left to the imaginative insight of Carl Jung to talk about the collective unconscious. Okay, so that is the first point that I wanted to highlight as far as Jung's contribution is concerned. Now, what about archetypes? Now, there are 2 points that need to be clarified when we talk about Jung and archetypes. Now, Jung would say the collective unconscious provides the stage or the platform for archetypes to appear. Okay, so what I have done is I have talked about the connection between the collective unconscious on the one hand and archetypes on the other. So Jung would argue, particularly in volume 9, part 1, his collected works with the title Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. So what exactly is the connection between the collective unconscious on the one hand and archetypes on the other? Jung would tell us the collective unconscious, it provides the stage, it provides the platform for archetypes to appear. Now, what are archetypes? Now, whether it is Frei or Jung, both would give us the same definition. Okay, so what is an archetype? Anything that is recurrent. It could be a character, it could be a motive, it could be a theme, it could be a plot, anything that is repetitive, anything that is recurrent, but of course with different degrees of displacement. So that would be an archetype. So therefore, dear friends, in this particular slide, I have talked about the major contributions of Carl Jung. There are 2 major contributions. It was Jung who came up with the idea of the collective unconscious. And talking about the association between the collective unconscious and archetypes, he says the collective unconscious that provides the stage or the platform for archetypes to appear. And archetypes in themselves, they are recurrent images, of course, with different degrees of displacement. Next, we come to a Canadian critic who was also a biblical scholar, Notre Frei. He lived from 1912 to 1991. As students of literature, we know Notre Frei as an archetypal critic. In particular, we are familiar with his 2 major publications, Anatomy of Criticism, 4 essays, which was published by Princeton University Press in 1957. The next one is a collection of essays, Spiritus Mundi. The subtitle is Essays on Literature, Myth and Society. Now there are 2 questions. How does Frei define an archetype, and what is the basis or what is the foundation of his archetypal criticism? And once I answer these 2 questions, I will answer a third important question. I said Jung is an archetypal critic, Frei also is an archetypal critic, but what would be the difference between Jung and Frei as archetypal critics find? Now, how does Frei define an archetype? For this, we have to go to his essay, Literature as Context, Milton's Lycidas. You find this essay in David Lord's anthology. So Frei would say, by an archetype, I mean a literary symbol, not one. It could be a cluster of symbols which are used recurrently. So the key word here is recurrently. You don't find it in one novel. You don't find it in one poem. You don't find it in one drama. You come across a particular symbol, you come across a particular character, you come across a particular theme in many works recurrent. Let me give you an example. You take most of the films, whether they are Indian films or European films or British films or American films, what is the theme? Love is the major theme. There is a boy, there is a girl, they fall in love, then there is a villain. We have come across this theme in hundreds and hundreds of films. So this is an archetypal theme, something recurrent. Now let me go to the second question. What is the basis or what is the foundation of Frei's archetypal criticism? The answer is, please look at the short quote. Frei's archetypal criticism is based on two organizing rhymes or patterns. One is cyclical, and the other is dialectical. Now, if you go to Frei's essay, The Archetypes of Literature, and it has been elaborated in Anatomy of Criticism, what does Frei do? His major contribution is, whenever I talk about Frei, I use these words, is holistic vision or synoptic vision. I repeat, his holistic vision or synoptic vision, wherein he is able to integrate everything and look at it holistically. Now, what does he integrate? We have the solar cycle, we have the seasonal cycle, we have the human cycle, and we have the corresponding forms of literature. For instance, early morning, we call it dawn, and dawn is very closely associated to spring, and spring is very closely associated to birth. Okay, so we have dawn, we have spring, we have birth of a hero, and the associated form is the birth of a hero is a joyful occasion. Spring is a joyful season. Early morning, one more day is a joyful occasion. So therefore, the corresponding literary genre would be comedy, dithyrambic poetry. So he fuses, he synthesizes the solar cycle, the human cycle, and the seasonal cycle with the literary genre. So this is what is meant by holistic vision or a synoptic vision. And the other foundation is the dialectical one, wherein he talks of positive, negative, day, night. Okay, so this is fine. Now let me come to the third question, an important question. Jung is an archetypal critic, and Frei also is an archetypal critic. And what is the difference between the two? Now the difference between the two, okay, I will tell you, I would make two statements. There is actually no difference between Jung and Frei. Jung talks about archetypes in terms of their recurrent nature, and Frei also does the same. But the major difference is Frei does not answer the question regarding the source of archetypes, whereas Jung would tell us the source of archetypes is the collective unconscious, and by positing the collective unconscious as the source of archetypes, he gets into trouble because it is not empirically verifiable or empirically validated. So Frei says, why should I get into trouble? So therefore, he refuses to answer any question regarding the origin of archetypes. Dear friends, next we come to an interesting person. Why do I say he is an interesting person? He is interesting because he belongs to our tribe, a professor of English, an American professor of English, Joseph Campbell. He lived from 1904 to 1987. He has two interesting books as far as mythology is concerned. The first one was published in 1968, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Look at the title. The title itself is very significant. The hero has more than 1,000 faces and more than 1,000 names. He is multifaceted, multidimensional. But then if you want a lighter reading, I would suggest the second book, which was published in 1988. This is not a book as such. This is a series of interviews wherein he talks about myths and the power of myths, and very readable and very insightful. Fine. Now, there are two things as far as Joseph Campbell and his contribution to mythology is concerned. Number one, we all should realize that Campbell was a comparativist. Okay, so therefore, what was his task? His task was to compare myths belonging to different cultures, different civilizations, and different religions. And what did he arrive at after comparing myths globally or internationally? He realized on the surface they may be different, But if you look deeper, the basic structure is the same. And for this, he had borrowed a term from James Joyce, who had used it in his Finnegan's Wake, monomyth, M-O-N-O, monomyth. So he says, on the surface of it, they all look different. But if you go to the deeper structure, you realize that basically it is the same. And that is why the quote, whether the hero be ridiculous or sublime, whether the hero be a Greek or a barbarian, whether a Jew or a non-Jew, a Gentile or a pagan, his journey varies very little as far as the essential plan is concerned. Okay, so he's a comparativist. Let us not forget about it. Next, I would like to talk about an important person, Roland Bass. Now, he's an important person, at the same time, not an important person as far as mythology is concerned. Now, I am not contradicting myself. I will explain. Now, Roland Bass. Who was Roland Bass? He was a French theorist. In particular, he was a semiologist. Okay, Elements of Semiology is one of his major works. And students, staff and students, we are all familiar with Roland Barthes's The Death of the Author, supposed to be one of the landmark publications as far as theory is concerned. Now, in 1957, in French, Roland Bass brought out a book with the title Mythologies. This was in 1957, and the English translation was made available in 1972. An e-book or an e-version is available on the internet. You can access it. Now, mythologies, look at the title. The title is misleading. What did I say? The title is misleading. A student of anthropology or a student of sociology or a student of literature, by looking at mythology, would jump to the conclusion, oh, it must be about ancient myths, it must be about primitive myths, it must be about Greek myths or Roman myths or Egyptian myths. None of these. That is why I said he is an important man, at the same time not an important man, because he is an important man because he has talked about the semiology or the semiological structure of myth. In that sense, is important for our discussion. But at the same time, he is not important because he does not talk about myth from an anthropological or a sociological or a psychological or a literary point of view. Okay. So that is why you look at the opening page, the first few pages, Roland Barthes makes it very clear that he is not talking about myth from the usual anthropological point of view. He looks at myth as a type of speech, a system of communication, a mode of signification or form. So in other words, his job is to talk about the semiological structure of myth, and then he says there are two levels. There are two levels as far as the semiology is concerned. And what is significant about level 2 is Saussure talks of a linguistic signifier, linguistic sign, and the two dimensions of the linguistic sign, namely the signifier and the signified referent. So he says, level 1, you have the signifier and the signified. Signified is the referent. And level 2, the signified becomes the signifier of level 2. In other words, to put it in very simple language, he talks about denotation and connotation. I'll give you two examples. Now, Roland Barthes himself, the first example that he uses is he talks about a French magazine, Paris March, and he says, you look at the cover page, he's referring to a particular issue of the journal. He says, look at the cover page. In the cover page, a black French soldier is seen saluting the French flag. I repeat, a French soldier is saluting the French flag, but it is not a white French soldier, but a colored French soldier. Now, immediately, what is the conclusion that you arrive at? You appreciate the nationalism or the patriotism of the soldier. Even though he is colored, he still salutes the French flag out of patriotism. So you would like to applaud his patriotism. So this is at the surface level. But at a deeper level, Roland Barthes will tell us, okay, don't look at it only from a nationalistic or a patriotic point of view. You also look at it from another level, that is something smacking of imperialism. Okay, so level 1, level 2, denotation, connotation. Now I'll give some very simple example. You take a soap advertisement. You take an advertisement for Lux. Now what does the advertisement sell? Is it selling a soap or is it selling beauty? Or you look at a cigarette advertisement. Is it selling a cigarette or is it selling manliness, a macho figure? So denotation, connotation. So dear friends, that marks the end of my second unit of my presentation. So in the second part of my presentation, I talked about 9 important myth scholars drawn from diverse fields: anthropology, sociology, psychology, phenomenology of religion, philosophy, and finally semiology. So Cassiere, he talks about myth, language, and science, and then he says myth is level 1, language is level 2, and science is level 3, or the advanced level, and this is how a culture develops over time. So this was the contribution of Cassiere. Malinowski, the Polish-born British anthropologist, he talks about the functional or the utilitarian dimension of myths, and then he comes to the conclusion based on his own extensive research work with the Trobriand Islanders. He says myth is a charter, a pragmatic charter, something like a rule book or a book of constitutions. Then I talked about Mircea Eliade, a big name, not only in the domain of mythology, but also in the realm of phenomenology of religion. He talks about 3 categories of myths: myths of cosmogony, myths of anthropogony, and myths of theogony. Then he also argues that myths are basically paradigmatic. In other words, we are in profane time. We want to get back to primordial time or sacred time. And what is the passage? What is the root? We try to imitate the exemplary acts of gods and goddesses, and through this imitation we try to get back to paradise. So that was Eliade. Levi-Strauss, the French structural anthropologist, he is not interested in the utilitarian dimension of myths, nor is he interested in the etiological character of myths. Instead, he focuses on myths that are strongly structured or highly structured, and ultimately he has an ideological meta language. And what is that? He wants to tell us, look here, you think that the primitives were very backward. No, the primitives were not backward. You look at their thinking, it was as advanced as our own thinking. So this is the ultimate line of his article, The Story of As Demythologization. Next, I talked about Paul Ricoeur, the a French philosopher. He talks about 3 characteristics of myths: the universality of myths, the temporal orientation, and in particular, he talks about the ontological dimension. He talks about the rupture or the cleavage, the passage from innocence, purity, holiness to guilt, in his book, The Symbolism of Evil. Next, I talked about Jung. While Freud talked about the personal unconscious, Jung talked about the collective unconscious, and Jung argued that the collective unconscious provides the platform for archetypes to make their appearance. Then Frei, I underline Frei's synoptic or holistic vision, which is based on the 4 cycles on the one hand and dialectics on the other. Next, I talked about Joseph Campbell, who was a comparativist. He undertook a comparative analysis of myths belonging to different cultures, different traditions, and different religions. And he came to the conclusion that they are all basically fundamentally the same. And finally, I drew your attention to the major insight of Roland Bass, who has shed light on the semiological structure of myths. So dear friends, next we go to the third section, where very briefly, I have 3 slides. Very briefly, I would talk about the connection between myth and literature. Now, Vincent B. Leach, in one of his essays, he talks about 3 kinds of connection between myth and literature. He talks about a thematic connection between myth and literature. He talks about a formal or a structural connection between myth and literature. And he also talks of a cultural connection between myth and literature. So if we raise the question, how are these two connected? How are these two related? The answer is they are related thematically, they are related formally or structurally, and they are related culturally. Fine. Now, what exactly do we mean by a thematic connection between myth and literature? Now, you take literature, not only Indian literature, but American literature, European literature, African literature. What are the major themes? Some of the significant themes, some of the fundamental themes. Okay, love is a major theme, death is a major theme, sibling rivalry is a major theme, deluge or floods, that is a major theme, virgin birth is a major theme. Okay, so these are major themes, perennial themes, archetypal themes. So this you find in literature and you also find in myths. Okay, so as far as theme-wise, thematically concerned, there is a very close connection between myth and literature. Now, next we need to talk of the formal or the structural connection between myth and literature. Now, you take a novel like James Joyce's Ulysses, or you take James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Now, the story is based on a Greek myth. Okay, if you take Joyce's Ulysses, we have the myth of Odysseus. Odysseus is the Greek term, and the Latin version is Ulysses. Both are the same. The only difference is in Latin it is Ulysses, in Greek it is Odysseus. After the Trojan War, he wants to come back to his home, and on the way, what happened to him? So that is the story of Odyssey, that is the story of Odysseus, or that is the story of Ulysses. Now, there are two questions. You take Joyce's Ulysses, you take Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. As far as the theme is concerned, as far as the story is concerned, both the novels, they have borrowed the theme, they have borrowed the content or the subject matter from Greek mythology. Fine. Now, the point is, not only the story, but the formal structure or the structural elements also have been borrowed from Greek mythology. In other words, if you take A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the story is Greek, and the way the novel has been structured, the way the novel has been plotted, that is also Greek. So therefore, as far as Joyce's Ulysses is concerned, as far as Joyce's A Portrait is concerned, there is a thematic connection in that the story is from Greek mythology, and there is also a formal or a structural connection, that is, in addition to the story, the way the story has been modeled, the way the story has been plotted, the way the story has been structured, the scaffolding, that also has been borrowed from the Greek myth. Now, there also exists, in addition to a thematic connection and a formal or a structural connection, there also exists a cultural connection between myth and literature, and this also has been highlighted by Bass in his article. Now, what does he mean by the cultural connection between myth and literature? Now, what does great literature do? And what does great myth do? Okay, the answer is the same. So, great literature, great novels, great poems, great dramas, great short stories, in addition to the aesthetic dimension, there is the normative dimension or the ethical dimension, not blatantly, not explicitly, but in a very subtle manner. Okay, so in other words, imparting values. This is what great literary texts do. And what about myths? They also do the same thing. So, therefore, talking about the connection between myth and literature, we realize that there is a thematic connection, there is a formal or a structural connection, and there is a cultural connection between myths on the one hand and literature on the other. Fine. Now, when we look at literary texts, we realize that myths have been used in literature, myths have been used in literary texts in three different ways. Now, in some texts, I have given two examples. You take Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher. Okay, even though he was a philosopher, he has written a number of dramas, and one of his important plays is called The Flies. Please read it. And we have Girish Karnad's The Fire and the Rain. So Jean-Paul Sartre's play Flies and Girish Karnad's The Fire and the Rain, they both are based on the story of Orestes. What is the story of Orestes? Orestes, okay, Orestes, if you go back to the Greek drama, if you go back to the Greek tragedy, it is available in three parts. The first part is called Agamemnon, the second part is called Libation Bearers, and the third part is called Eumenides. Okay, so it is the story of Agamemnon on the one hand, and it is the story of Orestes on the other. So Agamemnon is Orestes' father. So he returns home after the Trojan War victorious. But the moment he reaches home, he is murdered by his own wife, Clytemnestra, with the help of her lover Aegisthus. Now this enrages the son and the daughter. The son is Orestes and the daughter is Electra. We read about Electra complex. So what happens? The son and the daughter, they avenge the death of their father. So they kill their own mother, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus. Now what happens? The Furies. In Greek mythology, we hear of the Furies. They are evil spirits, not exactly evil, but they are called the evil spirits or ferocious spirits. They chase Orestes, okay, and finally he takes refuge in a temple, and finally they promise him that they will not harm him. And towards the end of the play, we also hear of the birth of Athenian democracy. So this is Orestes. So if you look at Jean-Paul Sartre's drama Flies and Girish Karnad's The Fire and the Rain, we realize that the myth of Orestes has been retold. That is the first category. Now you take two other literary texts. You take T.S. and Lovers. Maybe if you're a student, maybe the first time you read, you're unable to detect the mythological dimension or the mythological connotation. So therefore, the second category talks about veiled references, hidden references, crypto references to an ancient myth. And two very good examples would be D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers and T.S. Eliot's The Family Reunion. Now, in the third category, we have James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and we also have James Joyce's Ulysses, which is his masterpiece, where the entire novel is built on the scaffolding that has been erected on the basis of the Greek mythology, thematic and structural modeling. Earlier, I said, not only is the story, but the scaffolding also, the structure also has been provided by the Greek mythological story. So therefore, we have, when we look at literary texts and raise the question, how do literary texts use myths? We have three answers, we have three versions. A myth is adapted and retold. I have given two examples. Then we have literary works where there is no explicit mention of any Greek myth. We have to find out the mythological references and their connotations. And finally, we have a thematic and structural modeling. Okay, I have already talked about it, classical myths revisited. Okay, and the best example would be Eugene O'Neill's Morning Becomes Electra. So dear friends, that marks the end of the third part of my presentation. So in the first part of my presentation, I answered two questions. How do we define myth and how do we articulate the characteristics of myth? That was the first part. In the second part, I drew your attention to 9 significant myth scholars drawn from various fields. And in the third part, very briefly, I talked about the association between myth and literature. I talked about a thematic connection, a formal connection, and a cultural connection. Now let me come to the last part of my presentation. I will take a little less than 10 minutes. Myth hermeneutics. I have 3 slides. Now, before I talk about myth hermeneutics, very briefly, I would like to talk about what is hermeneutics, because for some students, only for students, this may be a new term, this may be a new word. Now, to put it in very simple language, hermeneutics would mean a theory of understanding or a theory of interpretation. Now, students may wonder, feminism also is a theory of interpretation. Marxism also is a theory of interpretation. Postcolonialism also is a theory of interpretation. Then how does hermeneutics differ from the other critical theories, the other literary theories? The answer is very simple. While the other theories focus on a particular text, which gets clarified using the theoretical framework or the theoretical lens provided by, let us say, feminism or post-colonialism or Marxism or structuralism or deconstruction. In hermeneutics, what happens is the focus is not on the text as such, the focus is on the process of understanding. That is why, please go to the last line. Hans Georg Gadamer, a major German philosopher of the 20th century, in his masterpiece Truth and Method, he would define hermeneutics as the understanding of not a text, not a poem, not a novel, not a drama, not a short story or a film, understanding of understanding itself in a self-reflexive fashion. Now, what exactly is myth hermeneutics? Now, when I talk about myth hermeneutics, I would like to borrow a major idea of a German theologian and existentialist theologian called Rudolf Bultmann. He was a theologian, not an anthropologist, not a philosopher. He was a theologian, and he was an existentialist theologian because he was deeply influenced and impacted by the theories of Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, and others as well. So he talks of demythologization. So what is demythologization? He makes it very clear, not that the myth is eliminated or removed, but it is interpreted. In other words, we talk about secularization in the name of hermeneutics. Fine. For instance, I walk into, let us say, a chemistry class, MSc chemistry class, or I walk into a BSc biology class, or I walk into a BSc mathematics class, and I tell them the story of Daedalus and Icarus, how they fabricated wings, and Daedalus flew in the sky. Icarus also flew in the sky, but Icarus went close to the sun, as a result of which the wax melted and he crashed into the sea. What would be the reaction of science students? They would laugh and tell me, are these stories believable? How can a man fly? How can a man fabricate wings and fly? Is it possible? Does it not go against science? Okay, so that is why one of the meanings, one of the popular meanings or the connotations of the word myth is an unbelievable story, a cock and a bull story. Okay, an animal that can breathe fire, an animal that can jump over mountains. Is it possible? Is it based on science? Is it based on rationality? Okay, now Bultmann would say, no, don't look at a myth in the literal sense. Don't look at the surface meaning. Don't look at the denotation. You interpret the myth. You look at the hidden meaning. You look at the message. You look at the deeper meaning. Don't worry about the denotation. Look at the connotation. In other words, he says, you secularize the myth. You remove the religious part and look at it from a secular point of view. In other words, Saussure, talking about Ferdinand de Saussure, the father of modern linguistics, talking about the linguistic sign and the two dimensions of the linguistic sign, he talks of the signifier, which is acoustic, which is phonological, and he talks about the signified, what the signifier refers to, what the signifier points to, the signified or the referent. So Bultmann would tell us, we will modernize an ancient myth. Okay, I repeat, Bultmann would tell us, you take an ancient myth, but put it in a modern setting, put it in a contemporary setting. We will modernize an ancient myth. Okay, so in other words, an ancient myth or a primitive myth or a classical myth, that would be an ancient signifier. And when you give a modern interpretation or a contemporary, when you undertake a contemporary reading, it becomes modern signified. So an ancient signifier and a modern signified. And I'll give you an example. I have one more slide. I'll finish in 3 minutes. Okay, so now this slide is very interesting. Now James Joyce has left behind a lot of interesting letters, and these letters are available in 2 volumes, so please read them. Now I would like to refer to a particular letter that James Joyce wrote to his publisher Carlo Linati, an Italian, and the letter was written on the 29th of September 1920. A little before that, Carlo Linati, his Italian publisher, wrote to Joyce and asked him, Mr. Joyce, what are you working on? Are you working on any new novel? Then Joyce wrote back, yes, I am working on a new novel. It is called Ulysses. Then Linati wrote back, Ulysses, what is the story about? Does it have any reference to the Greek myth? Then Joyce wrote back, yes, it has a lot of reference to the Greek myth of Odysseus, otherwise known as Ulysses. Then Joyce writes, what is my purpose? He says, look at the line, my intention, okay, my aim, my objective in transposing the Greek myth of Odysseus to my own novel called Ulysses is sub specie temporis nostri. Sub specie temporis nostri. It is a Latin expression which means, the literal meaning is under the vision of our reality. In other words, he says, I am demythologizing. Okay, so when Carlo Linati asked James Joyce, in your new novel, which you would like to call it Ulysses, what are you trying to do? Joyce answered, I am demythologizing the ancient myth of Odyssey or the ancient myth of Odysseus. I am giving it a contemporary meaning. What did he do? He said, I am giving it a contemporary meaning. The original Odysseus myth, the original myth of Odyssey and Odysseus, it was placed in ancient Greece. But Joyce's Ulysses, Joyce's myth is placed in Dublin, in Ireland, in Dublin. Okay, so what is he doing? He is demythologizing. Now, there is one more interesting explanation. In 1922, we have two important publications. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland was published in 1922. A little later, James Joyce's Ulysses was published in the same year in 1922. So 1922, we have Eliot's The Wasteland, and in the same year, we have Joyce's Ulysses. Now, when Joyce came out with his Ulysses, T.S. Eliot wrote in the journal that he edited, the Dial, and in fact, the Wasteland was originally published in this journal, the Dial. So he says, Mr. Joyce's parallel use of the Odyssey, a continuous parallel between, look at the terms, very significant, contemporaneity and antiquity. So the pastness of the past and the presentness of the past. In other words, this is my last slide. So what happens is, the question that we need to ask is this: what is demythologization and what happens in demythologization? Okay, so what is demythologization? As Eliot put it, the past has to be fused with the present. I repeat, the past has to be fused with the present. You take an ancient myth, you take a primitive myth, okay, put it in a contemporary setting. So give it a modern name, give it a modern setting, okay. So you take Joyce's Ulysses, the setting is Dublin, and the character is called Stephen Bloom. The character is not called Ulysses or Odysseus. So this is demythologization. Now, in the process of demythologization, there is a challenge, and that is an enormous challenge or a huge challenge. And what is the challenge? Fidelity to the original, and at the same time, there should be an element of change. You cannot completely drastically alter the nature of the primitive myth or the classical myth. You have to be faithful, fidelity to the original, faithfulness to the original. But at the same time, when you transport it to a different time, to a different culture, to a different setting, you ensure that it is faithful to the original. At the same time, there is an element of change. Ultimately, what happens is, earlier when I was talking about Paul Ricoeur, I said his major contribution is myth hermeneutics. And I said I will explain myth hermeneutics a little later. What is that? Please look at the last two lines. Paul Ricoeur makes it very clear. Myths will be always with us. Okay, even when you become scientifically and technologically advanced, you can never get rid of myths and religion. They will always be with us, but we have to interpret them and make them relevant and contemporary to the modern men and women. And this is the message of Paul Ricoeur, and this is the end of my presentation. And of course, I would like to refer you to an important quote by Friedrich Nietzsche, taken from his book, The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872. This is a very interesting book. Even though the title says it is the birth of tragedy, the book talks about the birth of tragedy and the birth of comedy. And here he says, he talks about how myths are very important to any culture. And that is why when we study American literature, we realize that the roots of American literature are shallow, unlike Indian literature or unlike British literature. So therefore, myths are absolutely essential for any culture. Now, dear friends, those of you who want to pursue further and read further as far as mythology is concerned, I would like to give you a list of books. So I would like to single out three important books. Now, Lawrence Coupe, that is one of the recent books published by Routledge, 1971, but I was not greatly impressed by this book. Now, Ruthven's book, K.K. Ruthven, he has a monograph called Myth, 1976. I found it a good book. Now, the fourth one, it is a collection of essays by Alan Dundas. The title is Sacred Narrative Readings in the Theory of Myth. And finally, in 2003, I brought out a book called Myth and Literature. So that was in 2003. So dear friends, that marks the end of my presentation. So what did I do? In the first part, I talked about myth and spelled out the characteristics of myth. In the second part, I talked about the contributions of 9 important myth scholars. And in the third part, I mapped or spelled out the association between myth on the one hand and literature on the other. And in the fourth and final part of my presentation, I underlined the need for myth hermeneutics. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful session. As always, you have done a wonderful session today also. It was a very clear illustration with a lot of examples. It was so clear for all the students, all the participants who have joined today, where you have given a wonderful elaboration of myths, the categories of myths, the thematic and structural and also cultural connection of myth and literature. You have brought in a lot of examples to illustrate. So it was indeed a great session. It is usually a hard nut to crack, but you have made it very simple with the vast experience that you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we'll have, thank you, sir. Now we'll have the questions and interaction. The participants may kindly use the raise hand option. You will be unmuted and you can ask questions directly. And also you can put your questions in the chat box as well. So I think there is one Professor Mridul. You may kindly ask the question, sir. Professor.
Hello, Dr. Duraj. Thank you for that wonderful presentation, sir. So my question is that can you comment on the retelling of mythologies? I mean, like if you consider Mahabharata, there are a lot of retellings of Mahabharata within India. You have the Jain version, you know, the Kampa is there. Can you comment on that also, please?
Okay, fine. Thank you. That was an interesting question. Now you look at the last part of my presentation. I think it was in my penultimate slide. I refer to an article by Eva Kushner. Okay, now whenever you adapt a myth and give it a contemporary name, place it in a contemporary setting, what you have to do is, I talked about it as a huge challenge, fidelity of faithfulness to the original. At the same time, we need to incorporate an element of change. Fine. Now, when you think of adaptations of the Ramayana or the adaptations of the Mahabharata or the adaptations of the myth of Oedipus or Orestes, what you have to do is you have to be faithful to the original. But at the same time, when you render them contemporary, when you transpose them from primitive times to the modern times, when you transpose them from the Greek culture or the Indian culture to another culture, another setting, please remember you have to be faithful to the original. At the same time, you also have to ensure that there is an element of change. So there is a dialectics between these two, and you have to balance it very carefully. Okay, but the myths themselves, they lend themselves to any number of adaptations, and that is why we talk of transposition from one language to another culture, one medium to another medium, one religion to another religion. So transpositions, these offer endless possibilities, but we need to address the challenge of fidelity to the original and at the same time ensure that there is an element of change or innovation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. This
Yes,
is
good afternoon.
Deepti Ara from Manipal University, Jaipur. Thank you, sir, for such a nice session. Sir, I have a question regarding the retelling of mythology, myths, which is happening in India. Like, for example, if someone retells Ramayana from the point of view of, say, Lakshman's wife, Urmila, who's actually, in a way, absent from the actual narrative. So, does this come under demythology? Sorry, demythologization,
okay,
as you just put it, or it is something else? What it is?
Okay, now there are two questions. So basically, I think you're trying to ask whether there is a difference between adaptation and the retelling.
And yes, sir, exactly.
I don't think there is any major change or major difference between adaptation on the one hand and retelling on the other. Both are the same. And as students of literature, let us all be aware of the fact any retelling always means not 100%. Any retelling invariably happens to undertake a subversive reading of a text. Okay, for instance, in post-colonialism or feminism, we hear of retelling of text. For instance, GyaanELL has been retold. Okay, similarly, Shakespeare's The Tempest has been retold. So as students of literature, let us bear in mind that most times, I wouldn't say always, most times in retellings, in adaptations, what we do is we engage ourselves in a subversive reading of the text. Now, you gave the example of the Ramayana, how an absentee character, how the story can be narrated from his or her point of view. I'll give you another instance. Now, Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni has come out with another version of Mahabharata where the story is told by Draupadi,
right?
Palace of Illusions. So we can do it.
Excuse me, sir.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Excuse me, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Sir, could you please differentiate between a myth and a folk tale or a folk?
Okay. Between a myth and a folk tale. Okay. I will refer you to an article. I'll give you the title of the article. Now, the article is by a person called Bascom, William Bascom, Bascom. I repeat, this is an article by William, like William Shakespeare, William Wordsworth, William Bascom, Bascom. He has a beautiful article where he has clarified what is a myth, what is a legend, and what is a folk tale. And under 5 headings: belief, time, place, attitude, principal characters, he had brought out the differences and the distinction between myths on the one hand and folk tales on the other. I don't have the time to go into the entire exposition, but I want to give you 2 dimensions. Number one, myths invariably are sacred. They are narratives. They are sacred narratives because we come across gods and goddesses in myths. Whereas on the other hand, on the contrary, if you take a fairy tale, we don't come across gods and goddesses. So therefore, it is secular. A folk tale is secular, while a myth is sacred. So this is an important dimension. Now, the second important difference between a myth and a folk tale is, what about the time of action? As far as the myth is concerned, I gave you the example of the myth of Oedipus or the myth of Orestes or the myth of Odysseus. So what happens? What about the period? The period is remote. I use the Latin term in illo tempore, the primordial time, the ancient time. Whereas a folk tale, it can happen anywhere in any time. So these are 2 major differences between a folk tale and a myth. Okay, for further information and further points, please refer to the article by William Bascom, Bascom. Thank you.
Sir, good morning. Sir, good morning. I am Dr. Saji, Head of the Department of English.
One at a time, please. One at a time.
Sir, I am Dr. Saji, Head of the Department of English, ST Hindu College, Nagarkoil.
Yes, sir.
Sir, we were dealing with the theories of the Polish philosopher Bronislaw Masnowski, where he did a study on Cobriant Islanders.
Yes.
There he says that myth and social organizations are connected to each other. Can we connect this with the secular part of the myth when you said in the latest part? That is the relationship between social organizations and myth. Normally it is with religious organization.
Okay, now what I would like to clarify is, we needn't bring in religion every time we talk about myths. I repeat, we needn't bring in religion every time we talk about myths. There is a religious dimension, okay, but it is not there all the time. And that is why in my first slide, I clarify, myths are about gods and goddesses. They are narratives, they are sacred narratives. But at the same time, I refer to an argument by Professor G.S. Kirk, where he says, yes, myths are about gods and goddesses, but you look at the myth of Gilgamesh, or you look at the myth of Orestes, or you look at the myth of Oedipus, they are not about gods and goddesses. So predominantly they are about gods and goddesses, they are sacred narratives, but at the same time, we do have myths in different cultures, in different traditions, where the key players or the protagonists are not gods and goddesses. So there is a religious dimension, but not always. Okay, when we talk about demythologization, we need to remove the religious dimension and make them secular. Secular in the sense, to put it in a very simple language, give them a contemporary dimension. Okay. In other words, I gave the example, if I am talking to science students and if I tell them here is an animal that can breathe fire, they will laugh at me. So what do? I couch it in a language which will be intelligible to them, and this is demythologization.
Sir, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Sir, good afternoon.
One at a time.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Sir, myself Joyanto, and actually, I'm speaking from Assam, and I'm listening to you.
Okay.
And it was really very informative and interesting.
Thank you.
Sir, my query is obviously about the retellings, so you have already told. But I just want to know where and how we have to justify the creative liberties or the imaginative liberties that most of the people, they have been taking while retelling the mythical things? How do we justify, or how should we justify?
Okay. No, I don't have an answer. No, whenever you raise this question, I think earlier also another person raised this question. I think we have not talked about it, but I think at the back of our minds, we have A.K. Ramanujan and his article in mind, which generated a lot of controversy. And in Delhi University, the text was even banned. I think that is at the back of our minds. So therefore, I will also be a little careful. Okay, now the point is, in terms of literary theory and interpretation, myths lend themselves to retellings and to adaptations. But in the process, what may happen is, I said there are two factors to be reckoned with. One is we need to ensure that we are faithful to the original. At the same time, when we transpose it to a different medium, a different setting, a different tradition, we need to bring in an element of change. Okay, so now what happens is, in all religions, in all cultures, we have hard nuts, and then they go by the literal meaning of myths. Okay, so like it may stir up some controversy. So I think we need to balance it. At the same time, I am not suggesting that we need to be afraid of them. Okay, as interpreters, as exegetes, we have the methodological freedom to look at text in any way that we want, provided our methodology is sound and rigorous. But at the same time, we ensure that the interpretation is proper. No more than this, I cannot say. But as I put it clearly, at the back of our minds, we have A.K. Ramanujan and his article, and the fallout of this article, and what happened in Delhi University in the curriculum board.
Hello, sir.
So that is at the back of our mind.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Sir, it was an excellent presentation. And sir, I'm Shupa. And my question is, sir, if I am about to connect that apartheid, anti-Semitism, and Dalitism, can I connect this through any kind of mythical representation? Is there any interconnection among them? That means, sir, you told about thematical and formal and structural mythological divisions. So if we are connecting these three sections, how can we connect it?
Okay, fine. So you can find mythical parallels. Okay, now the basic reading is, there is an oppressive structure and a liberator comes and liberates people from the clutches of oppression. So this is basically the text. Okay, so you can find mythological parallels. Okay, so for instance, you take Judeo-Christianity, you have Moses. Okay, so what happened? The people were in slavery, the people were in oppression. God sends a messenger, Moses, and he liberated them. He brought them out of Egypt. So this you take as a model or a paradigm. And I am sure you have similar stories elsewhere also, in different cultures, in different religions. And this you can apply to Dalitism. Okay, because basically the point is, people are oppressed on the basis of religion and on the basis of caste, and they are looking for a liberator, and you can find mythological parallels. Okay, so and you can always apply them. So the mythological paradigms and how they are transposed to a given setting, a given culture, and a given environment. Thank you.
Good evening. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. My question is, what are the possible ways to apply psychological and mythical and structural elements in retelling stories, sir? And how long we have to use these elements?
Now, my question is, why do you want to combine these three? Okay, you can work from a psychological point of view, or you can work from a structural point of view. Now, why do you want to combine the three?
Because I have to organize my chapters in that way, sir. I am a research scholar.
Okay.
My guide yes, sir. My guide suggested me to bring all these concepts into my thesis, sir.
No, but right now I cannot answer, because I do not know on what you're working on and what is your theoretical matrix. So only when I get to know all this, then I'll be able to answer. But my suggestion is two suggestions. One is go by your supervisor, and the second point is if a particular approach does not lend itself, do not force an approach on the text.
Okay, sir.
Okay. For instance, you have a literary text that is not amenable to a feminist reading or a post-colonialist reading, please leave it. Okay, many scholars, what they do is they take the approach first. Okay, I want to do feminism, and later what they do is whatever text they come across, they want to force feminism or post-colonialism or post-structuralism. So the text would militate against such an approach. So please check if the text is okay or amenable to such an approach, then you can adopt it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Hello,
My
sir.
name is Dr. Ganesan. I'm a retired professor, sir, from
sir.
E-Road. It was an excellent presentation, sir. I
Thank
should appreciate the efforts you have put in. My question is, how do you relate myth and magical realism of Gabriel D. Marcus and the other Indian writers?
Okay, okay, sir. Now, I don't have an elaborate answer. I will give a quick answer. There is a close relation between magical realism and myth because some of the elements of myth are found in magical realism. For instance, the uncanny, the strange elements, all these are there in myth also. So therefore, what I would like to articulate is there is a close connection between magical realism and myth, particularly the strange, the uncanny, all these are there, the fantastic, all these are there in both dimensions, in both realms, both domains, not dimensions, both domains. So therefore, magical realism, myth, there is a close parallel.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hello, sir.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Hello, sir. Nisha Sharma from Government College, Chadawa, Rajasthan.
Yes,
sir, I have a question. Today, first of all, I must thank you for it was quite an informative session. So today we find quite different interpretation of the character of Ram and Sita. For example, we find that Dashrath didn't love Ram from when he was a kid, and different versions. And like in the Mahabharata story, Gandhari's Atmakatha, we find that Gandhari loved someone else, and when she got married to Kauravs, the person, Dhritarashtra, she put bandage on her eyes so that she may not see anybody else except her lover. So what would we call it? Is it demythologization or something else?
Okay, now there was some audio disturbance, so I was not able to understand your question fully, but I was able to comprehend the basic tenet of your argument. Now,
yeah.
I refer to Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher. Okay, so I would like to answer your question using the insight of Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher. Now, one of his books is titled The Conflict of Interpretations. Now look at the title, The Conflict of Interpretations. Whether you talked about a mythological text, it could be with reference to a literary text, it could be with reference to a religious text. So when there is a possibility for a plurality of readings and a multiplicity of interpretations, obviously you have the conflict of interpretations. There are so many interpretations, which is right, which is wrong, which is acceptable, which is not acceptable, which is okay, which is controversial. So he says where there is a conflict of interpretations, the best way to resolve is to bring in ethics. There is the ethical dimension. And what does he mean by ethical dimension? He says any interpretation that is authentic is acceptable, and any interpretation that is not genuine, that is not authentic, that should be discarded. So this is what he means by an authentic interpretation. And he says wherever there is a conflict of interpretation, he talks about it in terms of a wager, W-A-G-E-R. We have to make a choice. And your choice is you go for the genuine one and the authentic one and the truthful one.
Okay,
this is Paul Ricoeur.
Good afternoon, sir. This is Geeta. Sir, I would like to ask the question here. Does retelling of mythological stories leads to stereotyping?
Now, can you please explain?
Does retelling of mythology or the narratives of mythology leads to stereotyping?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. When you adapt an ancient myth and and contextualize it, it doesn't lend to stereotyping. Okay, but earlier the point was, what I had told you was, very often in literary theory and criticism, whenever we talk about a retelling or an adaptation, not always, but invariably, it is a case for a subversive reading. Okay, particularly in the domain of feminism, post-colonialism, and cultural studies, when you say this is a retelling from a subversive point of view, that is an oppositional reading. Okay, this is the traditional reading, this is the canonical reading. I would like to challenge it. I would like to indulge in an oppositional reading, and this is what we mean by retelling. Okay, so your fear is whether such retellings or such adaptations would become stereotypical. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It might, but not necessarily.
Sir, I have another question also. How does we interlink post theory with myth?
How do we interlink post theory with myth? No, I think I need some time to think about it. Maybe later.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Very good afternoon, sir. This is Meenakshi Kulkarni from Nagpur. It was
yes,
an amazing session, and I'm a big fan of yours, sir. It was a treat, visual and intellectual treat, sir. One simple question, sir. Sir, you asked, you gave your points on demytholization. On what basis do we select a particular myth and then use it in contemporary times, sir?
No, like whatever myth you want to choose. For instance, you take the myth of Orestes and then you want to do a present day reading of the myth of Orestes, and this is what O'Neill did. He wrote a play called The Morning Becomes Electra. You look at the story, you look at the characters, you look at the scaffolding. Okay, everything is modeled on Orestes. Now, what you can do is you can take the same story, the story of Orestes, and you can present it from your point of view, your cultural, your linguistic, your religious point of view. So, what I would suggest is practically all myths lend themselves for adaptations.
Okay, sir. So one more thing.
Good afternoon, sir.
Can the theory
This is Suman.
of space, can the theory of space be utilized in myths?
Okay, to some extent, because all myths, they are in a particular space. Okay, so whenever we talk of any text, whether it is a literary text or a religious text or a philosophical text or a mythical text, we have to talk about it in terms of spatio-temporal dimension. A text belongs to a particular time. A text belongs to a particular culture. So therefore, space and time, these two coordinates are absolutely essential to all texts, whether it is a literary text or a mythological text. So therefore, space does play an important role in any text, particularly in a mythological text.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. This is Suman. And I have a question, sir.
Yes, yes, Suman.
Sir, I am from Jamshedpur and I'm a B.Ed trainee. Sir, as you have tried to, sir, establish the relationship between the myth and the literature. So I have a general question in this context.
Yes.
Like, sir, when we define the myth part, we, sir, usually believe that it is shared by a particular society. Like the myth can, a particular society can believe on that myth. It is not necessary that all society will believe on the same myth. And on the other hand, when we talk about literature, we usually define the literature in context of period, like we are talking about a Chaucer age or we are talking about a Renaissance period. So, sir, like my question is, as the literature has gradually changed from ancient times to modern times, sir, do you think that myth has been impacted in the same way, or the myth has also changed with the change of literature?
Okay, now I have 2 points to address. Point number 1, yes, it is true, myth belongs to a particular time. Okay, you take the myth of Oedipus, it talks about a specific culture, namely the Greek culture. It talks about the pre-Christian era. So myths talk about specific cultures. But at the same time, they can be transposed to any time, any medium, any culture. The same would apply to Indian myths also. So you take the myth of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, they talk about a specific period, they talk about a specific setting. Okay, but they can be transposed to another time, another culture, another setting, another ecosystem, another environment. So this is the resilience of myths, and this is the flexibility that is inbuilt into myths. And the same thing applies to a literary text also. You take Shakespeare's Macbeth or Shakespeare's Tempest. It was written for a particular audience for a particular period, but at the same time, it can be transposed to another culture and another time, another medium, another setting. So therefore, all texts, even though they are bound by the 2 coordinates of space and time, okay, they have the ability to transcend time and space, the spatio-temporal constraints, and make themselves resilient, and we can relocate them, resituate them, and recontextualize them in different ecosystems and environments. So the resilience and flexibility, these are the 2 important characteristics to be underlined in this context.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
This is Rosalind Sophia, sir. Thank you for this wonderful session, sir. Actually, our pages are filled with your notes. Thank you so much, sir. Sir, I'm doing research on myths. Could you please give me some answers, sir, for this question? If we are imitating the past through myths, do we create any reason myth for our future generation, sir?
Okay, now this is an important question and it has been raised frequently. The question is, can we create modern myths? Okay, so this is an interesting question. Now we have 2 answers. Okay, yes, we can create modern myths, and no, we cannot by any standard create modern myths. Fine. Now I'll clarify both the answers. Now, the question is, can we create modern myths? The first answer is no. Now, why this answer? The answer is because we realize myths are traditional stories, myths are ancient stories, myths are primitive stories. So therefore, they cannot be any modern myth. Okay, so this is one perspective. Now, the other perspective is, some people argue, for instance, there is an article by a person called Hurd, E.W. Hurd. He says a modern myth can be created. Okay, fine. Now here, the understanding of the word myth has to be nuanced and differentiated from the traditional understanding of myth. If you define myth as a traditional, ancient, primitive story belonging to the primordial times, then obviously it rules out the creation of any modern or contemporary myth. But on the other hand, if you stretch the term myth, make it elastic and give it a new meaning, like anything that is imaginative, anything that has a fairy tale ending, anything that is stupendous, anything that talks about heroic feats could be considered a myth, then obviously we can create modern myths. Okay, because
one more question.
Because in the second meaning, what we do is we invest a new meaning for the term myth, and that new meaning is, it is a fiction, it is an incredible story. So any incredible story can be called a myth. Okay, for instance, very recently we had Wimbledon, and Djokovic got his 20th title. So we can say, oh, he has become a mythical figure. Okay, now when we say Djokovic by tying with Federer and Nadal, he has become a mythical figure. It doesn't mean that he is a figure like Orestes or Oedipus. Okay, but from another point of view, he has been endowed with extraordinary skills. In that sense, he has become a mythical character. So that would be the modern meaning or the modern rendering of the term.
sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, another question, sir.
Yes.
If we analyze a particular text as with the mythical elements and the human cycle like hero's journey, what will be the outcome or what focus we should give into the text, sir? That is, if we analyze archetypal criticism or archetypal approach to a particular text, what will be the outcome of the thesis or some other dissertation, sir?
Okay, now the answer depends on what text you have chosen. Okay, for instance, now I have written a book on James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So there the question that I had asked is like, what made it possible for James Joyce to reinterpret the Greek myth of Daedalus and Icarus and present it in a contemporary point of view? So that was the question that I had addressed. So similarly, when you read a particular text, you have to find out how the author has negotiated the mythical worldview and the contemporary worldview, and what are the questions that he has addressed, and you need to explicate those questions. So it depends on the text that you have chosen.
Okay, sir. Shall we approach mythology with the presentist theory, sir?
What theory?
A presentist theory.
No, what is
presentism? A presentism theory.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with this presentism.
Okay, sir. Sir, are we creating heroes through mythological or historical novels?
No, as I said earlier, how do we define a hero? We can talk about Oedipus as a hero, we can talk about Orestes as a hero, and we can talk about Lionel Messi as a hero in football, we can talk about Djokovic as a hero in tennis, or we can talk about Shah Rukh Khan and Amitabh Bachchan as a hero in the world of films. So what connotations do we give the term hero and how do we define? So that is important.
Sir?
Sure, sir. Thanks, sir.
Sir?
Yes?
Good afternoon, sir. This is Shiny from Bishop Weber College. I'm planning to work on the legends of King Arthur. And just like other myths, we have retellings of Arthurian legends. So I plan to work on the retellings of Arthurian legends. My question is, can we analyze these retellings from Lyotard's point of view? He talks about the grand narratives or the meta narratives, and he talks about the small or local narratives. Can we approach these retellings from his point of view?
No, I don't have an immediate answer.
Okay, sir.
But what I would suggest is earlier someone asked me the difference between myths and fairy tales. I referred that particular student to or professor. I'm not very sure whether she was a faculty or a student.
Okay,
that particular candidate to an article by William Bascom. So you also please refer to the article by Bascom, BASCOM. Because he differentiates a myth from a folk tale, and he also differentiates a myth from a legend. Okay, so I mean, basically, I want you to understand, Shiny, that a myth is different from a legend. These two are not to be conflated.
Okay.
Secondly, whether you can approach the legends of Arthur from a Leotardian point of view, a meta narrative and a mini narrative, I think it is possible, but you need a deeper understanding. Okay, and I'm sure you will be able to arrive at one, but it is possible.
What else can we approach these retellings with, sir, other than Lyotard's point of view?
No, you can talk about it, the legends of Arthur from a contemporary point of view. What is the contemporary meaning or the contemporary significance of the Arthurian legends? So that you can talk about it. And there you need to bring in the transposition from one age to another age, from one culture to another culture, from one literary dimension to another literary dimension. So transposition would play a major role in this hermeneutical exercise.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Shamshir, sir, do you have a question? Professor Muhammad Ibrahim Khan. If you have a question, you can unmute and ask the question.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Monimi Barua. I teach in Mumbai. Sir,
Okay,
first of all, thank you so much for giving us such enlightenment, and I hope it will go a long way. Regarding this myth and folklore that you just mentioned, William Bascom, who gives the difference. Sir, here the point is folklore is supposed to be very, very secular, unlike myths, which are basically sacred. But if we go through, I mean, one of the major critic and then writer of this folklore area only, Alan Duns, in his book Interpreting Folklore 1980, he actually brings out everything from the layman's point of view that one can understand the pros and cons of folklore. But one, like since your kind of scholar is in front, so definitely I would like to be enlightened, sir. That is what, just sorry. Yeah, so sorry. That's all. In folklore again, we have proverbs. Pick up any folklore from any culture or any part of the country or the world, you will always find proverbs into them, and they are part and parcel. Now, within these proverbs, supposing if there are 100 proverbs, around 60 to 70 or maybe little more will be based on women, projecting them in a very poor light, stereotype rule. For example, that particular proverb, a man may work from sun to sun, a woman's work is never done. For example, one of example I'm giving. So from that point of view, it really pains, I think, people of our fraternity maybe that, could we still call them secular, even though they are highly genderized? Sir, I would like to be enlightened from you. Thank you so much.
Okay, now I totally agree with your example. Now, my answer is folklore, they are the creation of a patriarchal society. So therefore, they need to be interpreted, particularly from an oppositional reading point of view. Okay, because they are against women, they have been created by a patriarchal society, a patriarchal tradition. So it is part of the folklore. Okay, so such discriminatory statements are part of the folklore, and we need to contest them, and they need to be subverted. So I totally agree with you that we need to undertake an oppositional reading, a gendered reading, and a reading meant to subvert the patriarchal ideological setup which is embedded in these folklore materials. I fully agree with you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, madam. There are a few questions from the YouTube. I'll read out one or two. There is one from Mr. Roger. He's asking, how can we empower the students nowadays to value the importance of myth and literature and be adaptive in its changes in our lives at present? There is another question.
Okay, now excuse me, I will answer this question. Now, whenever such questions are raised, I always think of a tree, the metaphor of a tree or the symbol of a tree. Now, what is visible is what is above the ground. Okay, but what is not visible is the deep roots, the roots that run deep into the soil. Okay, so myth is exactly like that. Myth is like the roots of a culture, the roots of any civilization, the roots of a society. And if the roots are not deep and strong, that culture is shaky. So therefore, all cultures need myths, but at the same time, not in their literal sense, and that is the problem with the fundamentalists and the religious bigots, not in their literal sense, but we need to interpret them and interpret them from an authentic and a genuine point of view. And I have already referred to Paul Ricoeur's conflict of interpretation, where it becomes an ethical wager. So therefore, we need myths, but these myths need to be interpreted so that they make sense to the modern men and women who are bound by a rational worldview.
Okay, sir. There is one other question. How can we connect myths with eco-criticism?
No, I don't have an immediate answer, but what I would suggest is you look for mythical figures who would support eco-criticism. So we do have mythical figures, whether it is in Western mythology or Indian mythology. Maybe you look for a hero or a god or a goddess who was a friend of the environment, who was a friend of animals. Okay, so then you bring that person, you make that person the patron of a particular ecosystem. So that would be the connection between myth and ecosystem. Okay, and both basically both value the environment and they revere the environment. So therefore there is a deep connection, but we have to find the appropriate mythical figure in this particular context.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Is there any other questions from the participant side? There are a lot of questions in the chat box, but we don't have time. It's now 1:12. So if there is one last question, anybody wish to ask a question or?
Sir,
yes.
is it audible?
Yes, it is audible.
Sir, good afternoon, sir. I am Jisha. I am doing my research on Odeon, a regional myth from Kerala. That Odeons are famous for shapeshifters, and they belong to the most subverted community known as Paraya. So, how can I connect this Odeon myth with eco-criticism?
Okay, now as I said earlier there was a question, is it possible to have modern myths? Here I clarify, from an anthropological point of view, you cannot have modern myths because by definition, myths are ancient, primitive and traditional. So therefore you cannot have modern myths. But then people use, I gave the example of Djokovic is a myth in the tennis, Sachin Tendulkar is a myth in the field of cricket. So you talk about a particular mythical hero. So here it has different meanings and different connotations. A person endowed with or blessed with extraordinary skills. This is on a different plane and this is a different connotation of the term myth. Okay, so therefore you can do it. But I'm not familiar with this story, but it looks more like a legend rather than a myth. So therefore you need to distinguish between these two terms. Is it a myth or is it a legend? Okay, so I think you need to clarify this and address this question before moving further in your research.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, dear participants, for your questions, making the sessions very interactive and lively. And I thank Dr. Joseph Duraj also for the wonderful way in which he had answered all the questions. We had about 500 participants in Zoom and about 500 participants in YouTube as well. And I'm sure all the participants had enjoyed the session thoroughly. And there is a take home after the session. I'm very happy to see the responses that you have shared in the chat boxes as well. So all the credit goes to the eminent resource person, Dr. Joseph Duraj, for making this session very fruitful and enlightening one. So once again, I thank you, sir. Let me now invite Ms. Abhisha Jose of MA English of Neshamani Memorial Christian College to propose the formal vote of thanks.
Okay, sir, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, to the one and all present here. It's my privilege to profess the words of gratitude towards everyone who were present in this national webinar, Myth, Literature and Hermeneutics. On behalf of the PG English Association and Internal Quality Assurance Cell, IQAC of Neshamani Memorial Christian College, Marthandam. First of all, I would like to thank the Lord Almighty who showered his blessings towards this section. Next, I would like to thank our chief guest, Dr. A. Joseph Duraj, Professor, School of English, Gandhigram University, Dindigul, for providing us with sufficient knowledge based on the topic myth, literature, and hermeneutics. Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable presence and your ideas have enlightened us. Thank you, sir. Next, I extend my heartfelt thanks to Advocate L. Rajadurai, correspondent of our college, providing his support and guidance for organizing this webinar. Thank you, sir. Next, I would like to thank Dr. K. Palraj, principal of our college, for providing immense support and encouragement to make these webinars successful. Thank you, sir. Next, I express the most sincere thanks to Professor R.S.T.B. Thomas, Head of the Department and IQAC Coordinator, for organizing this webinar by his tireless efforts and made this webinar a grand success. Thank you, sir. Next, I thank the organizing team for their hard work to making this webinar successful. Next, I owe special gratitude to all the participants who have come from different destinations for your support and cooperation in this webinar. Thank you all for your active participation. Thank you. Last but not least, once again, thank you for everyone making this webinar in a grand success. Thank you all.
Thank you, Abhisha Jose, also for the wonderful way in which you have organized this program. So thank you once again, Dr. Joseph Duraj, sir. Thank you,
Professor, and thank you, Professor Dunstan, and thank you, Reverend Dr. K. George. Thank you. Shall we leave, sir?
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.